in the future. Now gold is returning as a tradable commodity now. So many changes are in the offing. In the process, there may happen a de-dollarization. There may also happen at a later time a de-yuanization, de-rupianization. It is a process that will happen. Economic process will happen. Technology is going to play a bigger role now. Bitcoins, which costed 500 rupees 20 years ago, today each Bitcoin will cost 5 million rupees. Those who purchased Bitcoins 20 years ago, overnight can become millionaires. I met a guy in one country outside. He's an Indian. When he was there, he invested in Bitcoins 15 years ago. He came back to India. Today, he is a billionaire. Because when he invested only a few lakh rupees. Today, he is reaping, huge profits. Out of that, he is investing in politics, that money. So, what I am trying to say is, these processes are changing. Some slogans are coming, de-dollarization, etc., etc. Remember, countries suddenly don't give up their strength. America is not going to disappear. It's going to be there. And India's trade with America has already crossed $130 billion. And our target is $500 billion with America. If not dollar, how do we deal? Can you afford to take a Chanda and say, I want de-dollarization? Can you say that? You are dealing with America, with which your trade is going to be $100 billion. So, these slogans have a place. It's a change that is happening in the world. China is trying its best. China is spreading the influence of yuan, it's trying. But a different economic architecture is taking shape. Probably we have to wait and see how it takes shape and then what will be our role in that.
So, some reflections?
Oh yes, this is one area where probably I will sound a little discordant. I agree with you fully that in the technology area, India needs to do a huge catch-up. Ramesh is trying his best, in his semiconductor initiative yesterday, or his whole push for innovation. All that is meant for India to tighten its belts on in the areas like innovation and creativity. You talked about Israel. Do you know when was the first drone used in the world? In 1969 and by Israel. The first drone was used to survey, to keep an eye on the war preparation of Egypt along the Suez Canal. 1969. Two guys got inspired by a toy aeroplane that they saw in America. Toy aeroplane in America would have been seen by many of our forefathers there in America. They were there in America at the time. But these two guys felt that, if this can fly for children, why can't it fly for my military? That is how innovations happen. That is where creativity is required. Our problem is, while Israel started having its formal drones in military in 1978, in 2023 we are fighting over how to formulate regulations for drones. Forget about making drones, that's too far off. Our domestic drones we are making, but they are very rudimentary. They cannot be used in military and all. We import drones. Most largely the high-end drones we only import. What I am trying to say is, in technology arena, the world is going far ahead. We are still struggling in the queue. Where to stand? We are pushing each other. So India needs to do big in technological innovation and creativity. But there are youngsters here. I am telling you, innovation is not imitation. In India, imitation passes off as innovation. There is a stand here. This video recording stand. Somebody will make a stand out of a bamboo and he will say this is my new innovation. Low cost alternative to this stand. That's not innovation, they are just copying. Innovation is something original. Creativity is different from copying. We largely do copying. We don't create. So Indians need to tighten their belts in this area. We need to do a very, very big work in terms of our, innovation, our creativity area. Why we are dependent on Israel? Israel has a simple formula. Do you know? Israel manufactures very little. There is no manufacturing industry in Israel. They say that we are 8 million people. We can't be becoming a manufacturing market. We are innovation market. We sell new ideas, not new products. We as a country, with all intelligence, need to become those innovators. That is why Atmanirbharta. Atmanirbharta is not about standing our own feet and copying and making a copy or imitated the product. It's to develop our own technology, our own product. In that area, India needs to really do a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of hard work India needs to do. I hope the kind of push that Prime Minister is giving, he is investing heavily, he is spending a lot of money on innovation, defense technology. I hope society, our industry, our youngsters catch up. Some of them are doing. For example, in fintech area, we have done excellent innovation. Our fintech innovation, like our Aadhaar, our digital transaction technology that we developed. Today, country after country is coming to us to have the technology. In fintech area, we did certain fabulous innovations. But in defense tech, we are nowhere. In other areas, we are very much lagging behind. In chip manufacturing, we are nowhere. In chip design, we are nowhere. Very, very rudimentary our technology status is today. Please don't take me away. I'm not criticizing. I'm only saying we need to do a lot of catch up in those areas. So technology is going to be the future for us. That's why Prime Minister is emphasizing. Please focus on it. Be innovative. Get into startups. Create new products. Innovation and creativity should be the way forward. It applies to defense also. Our dependence for defense hardware and software is very heavy on the rest of the world. It has to come down, but making those efforts also. Thank you.
Outside. The premise of this question is the way the US diaspora or the American diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, or even the France diaspora, the amount of influence they have on their expatriate countries or where they stay, it's tremendous. So, in your opinion, is the Indian diaspora playing such a big role? Because they have a huge role in reimagining India, wherever they are. Is the Indian diaspora able to play a role where, like the Americans or even the Chinese diaspora, the kind of impact they have on their countries where they stay? I'm sure many in the audience would have stayed abroad and they've come back here. So they can also throw some light later on. So what is your opinion, the role of Indian diaspora in reimagining India?
In the last 10 years, ever since Prime Minister Modi's government came in 2014, a special focus has been there about using diaspora as an instrument in our foreign policy, in our diplomacy. So, wherever Prime Minister went, even now wherever he goes, he mobilizes the diaspora, tells them the success story of India in the last couple of decades, how India is progressing, and he enthuses the community and inspires them to become, of course, loyal citizens of their host country, undoubtedly, but ambassadors of India in their respective countries. You are right, other diasporas have been very active. Japanese used to be one of the ideal diaspora in the 80s and 90s. No, in fact 70s, 80s and 90s was the diaspora activism meant the Japanese diaspora. But Japanese are a very silent people. वो छाती पीट के नहीं बोलते कुछ भी, quietly करते हैं. They used to go and they went to America, the country which dropped nuclear bombs on them. They joined NATO in 1950. Idea was, okay, this is a powerful fellow, he can harass me anytime, so why not I hand over my defense responsibility to that fellow, let him handle my security. I will spend all my money adopting my country. A very wise decision. थोड़ा बहुत सेल्फ रिस्पेक्ट नहीं है क्या कह सकते हैं, अरे someone who bombed you, how can you join him? हो सकता है, it's a good question. But Japanese, being Japanese, they decided, let me hand over my headache of security to them. Americans are happy, these fellows went, but what they did was, they went to America, learned all the modern things that the Americans were teaching in their universities, submitted their PhDs in those universities for doctorates, but submitted a copy of it in Japanese universities. In 20 years' time, the entire technology came to Japan. Do you know, Ronald Reagan, as president, went to Japan in 1989 to sign a deal that please don't send more than 1 lakh your Honda cars to my country, America, because General Motor cars are not selling. My cars nobody is buying in America. If you are exporting your cars, where did Japan learn its automobile technology? From America. In 20 years they got it, developed it. One may say it's copycat technology. Immediately. But the activism of diaspora, I am saying. So Japanese were active, Israelis are active in the entire development of Israel was because of the expatriate Israeli Jews in America. They gave money, they were technology, everything. Indians are starting to play that role. Last 10 years, so much has changed. Number one today, you all must be having your relatives in many countries. You ask them, every Indian anywhere in the world would say one thing in common: I'm proud to be an Indian. First thing we brought was that pride. Once that pride is there, then you will become automatically the ambassador. Today, the effort has fructified. We are able to mobilize the support of diaspora in a big way. Retarded liberals. They are called libtards. Libtards are there everywhere. Among the Israelis also there are enough libtards. They write also some nonsense about it. Because when we go to Israel, we bump into fellows who say that we are liberal Jews. They abuse their country, they abuse their government efforts to control the Gaza Strip. They say human rights violation, nothing happens. तो वो जो ब्रीड है ना सब जगह होता है, इंडियन अकेले तो ज्यादा नहीं है, everywhere you have this task.
For all of us to see India poised so strongly in the international arena, but our own people are going and defaming India and talking bad about it and the Khalistani movement. So the question is, why are we soft on that? They can be eliminated in the day Modi decides. Why are we so soft on that?
And first thing you remember that what we need to do with what all we do, you don't have to declare. जो करना है वो करेंगे, वो अलग बात है, उसकी चर्चा ज्यादा नहीं, but इतना याद रखना that the simple old wisdom, Indian ancient wisdom, that the stones are always thrown at the tree which produces fruits. The successful will get big bags. So we should not get too much disturbed by them, except that we should know how to handle them. There will be, when you grow, when you rise, you will face criticism, you will face attacks internally and externally. There will be forces which want to, put you down, bring you down, crush you. Are you capable of tackling them or not? Do you have it in you to face them and teach them or show them their place? That is the question. I think we can show them their place. We are doing that. How we are doing? We don't have to discuss. We are doing it.
I read the papers every day to relax myself, and that is one case.
we have no intention to eliminate Pakistan or destroy Pakistan. No, let them live peacefully. But it is not our duty to run Pakistan. It's not our obligation. They have to run their affairs. Today they are on a path of suicide. How can we go and stop them? You have to do that. I mean, let them handle their affairs. We will not harm them. I will tell you, as Indians, we never wish bad for anybody. And these fellows are our blood brothers. But today they are on a wrong path. It is for them to correct themselves. As far as India's interest is concerned, we will safeguard it fully. Our problem with trade is only this much. For example, since I handled Kashmir, we used to have cross-border trade from Kashmir into Pakistan. From inside Kashmir, we had one route through which trade used to happen both ways. You know how it used to happen? From our side, these fellows, traders, would send, say, a truckload of apples. From their side, a truckload of saffron would come. Apples and saffron, are they exchangeable? One box of saffron is equal to 100 apples. But one truckload of apples will go, one truckload of saffron would come. They say, no, sir, this is the barter we are doing. We realize that's how they are funding terrorism in India. So, these kind of things that some fellows in Pakistan are capable of doing, so we will be careful in our trade. But let me tell you, it has not completely stopped. There are some areas where very, very minimal trade exchange happens, very, very minimal. But more important is how Pakistan wants to remain as a country. Whether they can remain as a country or something is going to happen, we don't know. And anyway, it's not our botheration. Let them handle it. We have better things to do in the world.
And we are likely to become the #1 most populous country in the world, but still we are not members of the UN Security Council. Any such development likely to happen in the next few years?
We have already become #1 in terms of population. Whether you should take that as a credit or probably you should be a little worried about it is a different thing. But on the question of Security Council membership, actually the United Nations as a body has become very, very redundant today. So there is a complete overhaul needed. Complete restructuring of that United Nations architecture is needed. That's why I said in my speech also, probably this whole tamasha of some countries having permanent membership should end. Let the system be something different. What should be that different system? On which probably one of your articles can be on that. What kind of a multilateral institution we should create? Otherwise, what is happening is when we say that we want to become a permanent member in Security Council, 4 other countries are standing up. They are also like, we also should become permanent members of Security Council. You can't say no to them because they are all your friends. So there is a kind of a competition for everybody to become a permanent member there or in Security Council. Ya to make everybody a permanent member, all the 197 euros, or build a totally different structure. Having said it, I agree with you that a country of India's importance, India's size and India's influence cannot be denied permanent membership in Security Council. It is an injustice to India, injustice to the whole mankind, whole humanity. India would have contributed enormously by being inside the Security Council as a permanent member. But the remedy is much larger.
One question, which is 2 parts. One is about the fact that India doesn't have a sovereign fund so far. For example, now building sovereign fund or Qatari sovereign fund. Has the time come to have a sovereign fund for India? Number 1. Number 2, we spend more lot of money in importing civil aircrafts. For example, Airbus, Boeing, would have sent a for about 900 aircrafts this year itself. Has the time come to do a collaboration with JV, maybe the Emperor or some other country, and start getting into producing aircrafts, civil aircrafts in India?
I am not an expert in economics, so I won't be able to answer your first question. I don't know too much about foreign funds and all. I know this much, that we don't have too much fund extra. Whatever money we have, we are spending on making our army strong, our
military strong, they are spending on that. So I don't know how sovereign funds work, so please excuse me on that. But on the other question, yes, you are right. In the civil aviation area, our job is possible. We are working on that. I mean, every time these fellows from Airbus and others come to meet our leadership tells them that at least make some parts in India, shift some manufacturing to India. They have their own excuses. Although I don't buy those excuses. They say that you see, this is an ecosystem. It's not just one factory that we bring to India and manufacture here. It's a complete ecosystem. So shifting the entire ecosystem from Europe to India is not easy, etc., etc. These excuses they give. Their excuses. Why I am calling them excuses is same Airbus, same Boeing went and established manufacturing industry in China. China has danda dilaya. I will give you the contract only if you come and manufacture in my country. Should we use data to tell them to come and do it? Unfortunately, we are not like that. We are not China. So, but effort is on. Right now, you know that General Electric has agreed to shift the manufacturing of its engines to India. General Electric's engines are used in many of the aircraft, especially in, you talked about Embraer or Boeing, or even our own HCL, whatever HCL is manufacturing stages and all. In that also, General Electric engines are going to be used, are being used already. So that manufacturing is coming to India. Slowly we should bring it to India. I totally agree with you. But again, if I talk from their side, yes, the entire ecosystem cannot be easily shifted to India.
Tight on either side, and we have seen what people coming from Nepal have been doing there in the news. I'm sure there are many more. How do we deal with these porous borders?
With Nepal, we have the agreement that any Nepalese citizen can come and work in India. There is no restriction. Similarly, any Indian can go and work in Nepal. There is no restriction. Between our two countries, traditionally, we have agreed to allow this movement, free movement of the people. That's why when you enter Nepal, whether it's through land route or airport route, you don't require any visas and all. You simply have to have a proper passport or ID, and that's enough. You can enter this country. We have had traditionally that kind of relationship, and we have no intention of changing that. We are okay. I mean, there will be some challenges, some issues, but in fact, they can join in certain Indian Army regiments also. You know, you will be surprised to know more than 100,000 Nepalese ex-servicemen are there in Nepal, and they regularly get pension from Indian Army. The pension is sent to Nepal and it is disbursed there. Because they were allowed at the time of the British also, and subsequently also we allowed them to work in India. Nepal relations are slightly different. Let us keep it that way only. We don't have to restrict it too much. But yes, we have challenges from countries. Like, Pakistan, we had a serious issue. We had some issues with illegal migration from Bangladesh. And today, in the northeast, the conflict that we are seeing has an element of illegal migration happening from Myanmar. There are a few issues which we are seized on. We have to tackle them carefully because these are all friendly neighbors. Bangladesh is a friendly neighbor. Sri Lanka is a friendly neighbor. So we need to deal with them a little cautiously, but trying to do that. But Nepal is a different case.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It was really insightful. My question is regarding, not rather question, but adding to the debate, I would want your opinion on this. You spoke about that India is the only country, but today obviously can speak to both Israel and Palestine, and then speak to all the countries which probably no other nation can do. But the foundations of this is essentially non-alignment movement. Whether we agree today or not, the foundations lie there. Parcel packaged strategic autonomy has developed throughout the years. So I would say that theoretically strategic autonomy unintendedly, whether you can call it so, unintendedly strategic autonomy was probably a consequence or an outcome of or a thought behind non-alignment. Probably today even more openly said in that sense. So how do you see strategic autonomy very different from non-alignment?
Oh, I actually explained to you. That's why I said non-alignment, there can be different judgments because it's history. History is prone to interpretation. So, something that has happened can be interpreted in many ways. One can say that the basis for entire foreign policy. Today also there are many scholars who believe that non-alignment was the basis for the entire development of India's foreign policy. But what I tried to say was non-alignment did not have any great ambition, great vision. It only had a limited vision that we should not be a party to any side in this bilateral Cold War politics. That was the limited role it had. The result was in 1962 when India faced a war with Russia, with China, nobody came to our rescue. That also was a reality. So that can be a value judgment. But strategic economy is different. In strategic economy, we are not staying away from anybody. We are only saying that I cannot be influenced by any one country in my dealings with the other country. That is strategic economy. This is also called de-hyphenation. Like today, the US put lots of pressure on us on the issue of procurement of S-400 anti-missile platforms from Russia. We told the Americans, we will buy equipment from you, more latest high-tech defense equipment from you, but we will continue to buy from Russia. S-400 we bought. 5 S-400 platforms we placed orders. I think 1 or 2 have already been delivered. So that is strategic economy. On Ukraine, on the Ukraine war, we told the Americans that there is no question of we joining you at the UN, of declaring a war on Russia, or fighting a war on behalf of Ukraine. We won't join you there. But at the same time, we told President Putin that it's not the time for war, it's not the time of era of wars. We continue to talk to both. Zelensky spoke with our Prime Minister 3 times already. We told him, yes, we are against war. So that is what is strategic economy, where you are not staying away from anything, you are actively participating but not siding with anybody. You are playing the role of somebody who can probably find solution. You tell me if there is a war, 2 sides are fighting, should there be a third person to arbitrate or not? Today, unfortunately, even United Nations is not in a position to arbitrate because United Nations is under the largely influence of the Russian powers. The funding comes from there. World Bank has stopped giving any funding to Russia, Iran, this country, that country. Why? America doesn't want it. Can an international institution do things like this? We may have 100 issues with America, with Russia, with Iran. We are against certain proliferation of nuclear weapons. That's all accepted. But day-to-day routine affairs, can they be impacted? That's how international institutions function. But there will be countries like India which play the role, which we describe as strategic autonomy. We play an autonomous role. We went to Israel, standalone visit Prime Minister made to Israel. He made a standalone visit separately to Ramallah in Palestine. That's called strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is not staying away from everything, remaining neutral. That was non-alignment principle. Here, playing active role in the today's global scenario. That is what we call a strategic autonomy.
This is a book on reimagining India in the 21st century geopolitics. It's a very important work because India has moved into a different trajectory. India is making a lot of commitments. India is seen across the world as a very important player, and this book looks at from rising India to economic aspects to technology to a lot of other things. It's a very important contribution.
This book reflects the way the Indian foreign policy is going and graduating to a next level, taking on as the role of the world power. So all the insights regarding the latest Indian foreign policy is in the book. I urge you to buy and read the book. Thank you.